So we've had quite a few sessions now, but I don't feel like we've really gotten to the root of the issue. Why don't you tell me why you're really here?
Oh, I just don't think that poetry is therapy. But I do think that it can be used as therapy and also can be therapeutic. Poetry is not therapy. But if we are to think of it as just therapy or just therapeutic, it narrows rather than expands the possibilities of the art. This video is going to be a deep dive into some thinkers, including Plato, Carl Jung, Owen Barfield, and Muriel Rukeyser, as we discuss this highly contentious issue. That brings me to some key questions I'd like you to consider as we explore this idea. Can poetry be truly therapeutic, or does that limit our understanding of its potential power? If we only see poetry as therapy, what does that imply about the quality and ambition of the art? And finally, what happens if our sole focus is on poetry's healing potential, potentially overlooking its other vital roles? Let me know what you think in the comments, and let's jump into it. My initial thoughts here are threefold. 1, poetry can be therapeutic, but it doesn't have to be, nor does therapy need to be the focus of poetry. 2, if poetry is only therapeutic, what does that say for the standard of poetry? Are we going to aim for excellence with the art if our only purpose is for it to make us feel better? And should we only be writing poems that will heal other people? And 3, if poetry is therapeutic, what happens if we see poetry only in terms of how it may heal us? I'm going to start with an immediate counter-argument. Can poetry, like the ancient Greek philosopher Plato believed, actually be harmful? Let's look at Plato's theory of forms. Imagine plucking a sunset red rose from a garden. In Plato's world of forms, that rose will have a perfect archetypal counterpart. Let's call this flowerness. Now take a bunch of other roses and throw a lily in there. This fragrant bouquet is comprised of individual flowers, yes, but to Plato, all of them correspond to that same perfect flowerness that exists in the world of forms. In this world of forms, then, this idea of flowerness would be the true and beautiful form. The flowers in our material world would be the copies or distortions. So, to Plato, each flower you see is a copy of the archetypal flowerness. Now think of a painter painting a flower. Plato would consider the flower in this painting a copy of a copy, even further from the form's flowerness, and therefore an even larger distortion of truth. Similarly, according to Plato, poets can only, at best, make copies of a copy, with its explorations removed from the true forms. He saw poetry as harmful and deceptive, not healing and uplifting, even for those who listened to the bards and felt mad with enchantment. Although I have sympathies with Plato's perspective on forms, and with all due respect to the great philosopher, poetry isn't quite the same as it was in his day and age, and its healing effects needn't be considered distortions of truth. In fact, it is truth that, even if just an emotional truth, in the way that a poem can shock, connect, or help us make sense of an experience, which can cause real and lasting change in us. If our encounter with a poem causes a positive change in us, I think it's fair to call it therapeutic. Either way, one thing is undeniable. Poetry is different because of Plato's critique of it. In stark contrast to Plato's concern about art being a mere imitation leading us away from truth, thinkers like the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who followed much later, saw immense value in the human psyche's expression through imaginative exercises like making art. Jung said that to think of art purely in psychological terms, to make claims like every artist is a narcissist, or that all art is a reflection of the artist's relationship with their parents, isn't all that helpful because it's too reductive. To draw a parallel with some Platonic thinking here, to reduce a poem to mere psychologization of the poet would remove it from its larger, unifying, living existence. This would devalue the art even if we hold its potential healing powers in high regard. Let's examine the definition. The word therapeutic comes from the Greek therapeutikos, from therapeutine, to cure, treat medically, or do service, take care of, provide for. The question arises, can poetry cure us or treat us medically? An argument can be made in some ways, perhaps, and in others, perhaps not. Poetry can help us make sense of an emotion or an experience, create meaning from it, and integrate it better, which can lead to healthier psychological functioning. There is plenty of evidence of poetry therapy helping people feel better. But is this all the art should be doing? Jogging, for example, can be therapeutic too, but should we only go for jogs as a form of therapy? You let me know. The question of whether poetry is therapeutic has been a discussion point for a long time, and there are a range of opinions from poets, therapists, and more. Personally, I've written poems that I found to be quite healing overall, as they helped me understand something in a way I didn't know before I wrote it. They helped me face something that I wasn't yet fully aware of. And in these writings, sometimes I stumble upon something truthful about myself, and this has caused change and called me to take action to better actualize that change from the realization. However, I remember when I was in my first year at university and I felt severely depressed. Alongside finding it difficult to adapt socially, drinking heavily, and waiting until 4 a.m. to go to sleep each night, I was missing a lot of my classes. However, I was writing poetry. But these poems, as I look back, were pieces that were making me wallow in these feelings and made me seek out attention to share what was, if I want to be kind to my past self, deeply mediocre work. Because of this, these poems reinforced my ego identification with the depression rather than help lifting me out of it. So, in short, it wasn't all that therapeutic. In fact, it had the opposite effect. In Kathleen Raine's essay, What is the Use of Poetry?, she tells a story of a young American who mailed her some poems alongside a letter. This letter stated that his psychiatrist advised him to get his poems published, as it would be, and I quote, good for him. Raine was unimpressed with the quality of these poems and was taken aback by the therapist's advice. Although Raine believed that poetry can have a healing effect on the mind, she pondered what good could have come from feeding an illusion. She thought that the student would be better advised to keep writing, or better yet, read and internalize some of the great poems as part of his poetic education and emotional growth. So Raine questioned the healing effects of getting those weaker poems published to the patient's ego and wondered how harmful it might be, as they could inflate his ego, detracting him from important inner work. Later, in that same essay, Raine asks the question, unless a work of art comes from a higher, a deeper source than the trivial daily mind, how can it enlarge, expand, or heal that mind? Of course, despite her affinity for Jung, they might have had a point of disagreement here. Jung believed that people would do anything, no matter how absurd, not to face their own souls, afraid of expressing themselves in the first place. Near the start of his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote that people should find their own myth, not follow someone else's. However, Raine believed being learned in myth, poetry, and art, things of the imagination, would help educate the budding artist to express themselves better rather than hinder them. Perhaps then, the greater the power and force of the expression, the greater healing benefits writing has the potential to have. If we are to accept Raine's thoughts on this, how can poetry that stems from this trivial mind be truly nourishing? How can it be therapeutic if it lacks the powerful qualities the best art has in it? Should we be thinking about art as therapy at all? Moving forward in this discussion, contemporary poets like Kim Addonizio offer a slightly different lens, acknowledging the therapeutic aspect while maintaining a distinction between art and therapy. In Ordinary Genius, she writes that we should not see art and therapy as the same thing, as there is a real distinction between the two. However, she argues that the truth is that art is therapeutic. It helps you take something that is within you and make a place for it outside yourself. Again, I would still argue that art, yes, it can be therapeutic. I wouldn't state that it is. I do not think there's a need for it to be or not to be. One of the reasons I fear reducing poetry to only its therapeutic nature is that it makes it seem like poetry has a singular purpose. That purpose is either to help us get on in our day-to-day, to be functioning members of a capitalist society that champions the loose idea of working hard, which will lead to material gain. Although we all know that working hard is not directly correlated to this material gain. Let's put it this way. A child who gets diagnosed with ADHD may get prescribed Ritalin because in his school that child is deemed disruptive. But the very nature of this school is asking the child to sit still for hours a day, listen, take tests. Therefore, the school's nature is not conducive to the child's thriving. If our society is not conducive to our thriving, would poetry as therapy perhaps just make us good little drone citizens feel that much better so we can go out and fit in and be productive in our jobs? If poetry is therapeutic, is it meant to function like Ritalin would for the child? Is it meant to make us, who may be square pegs, cram into the round hole of a standardized culture? Should poetry be making us fit in or stand out, individualize, find out who we are at our core, and see the world as we are as an individual? A better way to think of poems is that they are made up of units of meaning that comprise their whole meaning. I think that the more postmodern poets, known for their focus on fragmentation and questioning traditional structures, might disagree with me here because they use poetry to deconstruct, to fragment. I would argue that if there is something to deconstruct, there is meaning in the deconstruction. And we also need to know what comes after a meaningful reconstruction. There's only so much good you can get from perpetual deconstruction. Therefore, it is probably fair to say that the poet should focus more on capturing meaning and connectivity in their poems, and how each poem's unique quality of sound, rhythm, image, music, symbol, and more comprise the poem, than concentrating merely on its therapeutic effects. This may take a different form inside a therapist's office, but the therapeutic effects, if they are to be experienced from a poem, will likely happen naturally during the writing or perhaps reading of certain poems. Why? Because through meaning and finding the most beautiful way to put language together, any therapeutic effects that need to emerge will likely do so on its own. And if the poet makes the connection between the meanings of the poem and their own life, it would be up to them to change their lives as a result of the meaning that they found. However, trauma therapist Dr. Erica Scott has taught me that a mixture of art, poetry, and other creative therapy modalities has helped many people overcome things like alcoholism, trauma, and a host of other mental disturbances. Again, without needing to reduce the art, it is undoubtedly true it can and does have therapeutic benefits to some people. Furthermore, in my conversations with the national bestseller, author of How Words Change Your Brain, and expert neuroscience researcher Mark Waldman, I've learned that speaking more poetically, through slowing down, finding metaphors, and adding a rhythmic element to your speech can deepen your relationships with others and help you heal. Although speaking poetically for meaning is not a new insight, there is much neuroscience research which has confirmed this to be true. Take Owen Barfield, for example, who wrote his marvelous book Poetic Diction in 1928. Barfield argues that there is a poetic element present in all meaningful language. If we are to accept this point, what does that say about poetry that expressly is not therapeutic? If our meaningful language is poetic, what does that say about our usual day-to-day conversations? Could we get out of the trivial mind Raine discussed and into that higher mind to write better poems that could be more therapeutic because they help us make sense of our most complicated experiences and emotions? Under the clear influence of Coleridge, Barfield goes on to write that only by imagination can the world be known. This is true. Even though we receive and interpret our sensory impressions, creating any meaning out of all of them requires our imaginations knit these things together. Imagination is at the cornerstone of many things, from future planning to empathy to problem solving to artistic expression. I am immediately brought back to Jung here, as he believed that the psyche was a self-correcting organism. Like the body, the psyche attempts to balance itself so it can function optimally, similar to biological homeostasis. Jung believed, among many things, that dreams were the psyche's way of achieving this, especially when the dreams were reconstructed and discussed in the therapist's office. He also believed that psychotherapy more generally, making art, and paying attention to synchronicities helped balance the psyche as well. Now, Barfield argues that there are three functions that poetry is there to perform. The first is pleasurable entertainment, which he warns must never be forgotten. The second is the making of meaning, which gives life to language and makes true knowledge possible through the vehicle of the imagination. His last function is that art should be a mirror, not necessarily an approval, of the characteristic response of the age in which it is written. With Barfield, Jung, and Raine in mind, poetry is better thought of as an art of making meaning with potential therapeutic benefits. Poetry can be nourishing, beautiful, soulful, completing, funny, dark, and create change. Muriel Rukeyser sees poetry a little differently from these thinkers. She says that poetry is an invitation. What does it invite? She asks. A poem invites you to feel. More than that, it invites you to respond. And better than that, a poem invites a total response. A total response means the full force of consciousness, body, heart, intellect, intuition, sensory engagement, and anything else you can bring to the art with your utmost attention. Besides, poetry can be historical or prophetic. It can be healing, used as resistance, beautiful, elevating, destructive, terrifying, rewarding, truthful, strange, or dangerous. Poetry allows us to plumb the depths of the human experience, helps us understand and interpret our world, and affect our relationship to it individually, socially, culturally, phenomenologically, spiritually, and more. It also helps us find language to express the various complexities of life. Besides, writing something can change our relationship to an emotional event, which can provide us with the necessary healing qualities. When we hear a poem, we have measurable and unique physiological responses. One study published in the Journal of Social Cognitive Affective Neuroscience found that recited poetry can act as a powerful stimulus for eliciting peak emotional responses, including chills and objectively measurable goosebumps that engage the primary reward circuitry. Experiencing peak emotional responses and these physiological responses can foster new understanding and change, causing awe or appreciation. Owen Barfield would call these reactions a felt change in consciousness. However, again, these needn't be or might not necessarily be therapeutic. To see poetry as just therapy would take away some of the mysterious quality of the art and its ability to reflect and change human consciousness and the age in which it is written in. Human consciousness and the human condition are too rich and complex to reduce to therapy. And as poetry pulls together the fragments of human experience, which we are deluded into thinking is unitary, it allows us to create a form that appears solid, but that pulses and moves and lives as it is different humans in different places in different times who interact with it. Unlike Plato's passive reception of a distorted copy, engagement with poetry, whether through writing or reading, is an active process of meaning making and feeling. This active participation, this total response, as Rukeyser suggests, moves beyond the static imitation Plato feared, creating a dynamic space where healing or other beneficial effects can emerge organically, tied not to a perfect form necessarily, but to the messy, vital reality of being human. I'd like to state clearly my thoughts from this video. 1. Poetry can have a therapeutic effect. 2. Poetry is an art. It communicates, has cultural value, and standards of quality. 3. If one goes into poetry for the therapeutic effect alone, it may backfire, producing weak poetry and/or further psychic distress. 4. However, improving as a poet, engaging in expression and communication may increase the therapeutic effect of writing only for oneself. What do you think? Do you find reading or writing poetry to be therapeutic? Can you think of a time when a poem was especially therapeutic to you or another? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to have a discussion about it. And if you want to learn more about poetry, click like, click subscribe, and sign up to my mailing list in the description box below. Oh, and watch that video that's coming up. You know you want to.